annual. All right, if we got a journalism guy next year, you can say second. This is what happens. We get into arguments between journalists and lawyers all the time. Yes, lawyers are mucking it up. On behalf of the law school, I'll let Dean Kirby welcome you in a moment. On behalf of the law school, I would welcome you to this program made possible by our alum Price Sloan, who's here with us today. Price has endowed this lectureship symposium series that we're going to have. This is the first one. Very good. The first of many to come. This one is focusing on discussions about free speech on campus and free speech in general and all the things that go along with that. And so thank you for coming. I'll turn it over to Dean Kirby, the co-sponsor of this program.
So again, thank you to Price Sloan for making this possible. We really appreciate it. Just a welcome to all of you from the School of Journalism. We're delighted to be a partner in this. As you might guess, the journalism school, the World's Journalism School, cares deeply about the First Amendment. And the thing that I'll say is that most people say, oh yeah, freedom of the press, that's what they care about. No, we care about the entirety of the First Amendment and the freedoms that it brings. And so that has shown through in the 108 years. Last Wednesday was our anniversary, being the oldest journalism school, and we've been talking about this those entire 108 years. And this is an important gathering of great minds, and we hope for great discussion. And we're delighted to be here, and we hope we get a lot out of it. So thank you.
Well, good afternoon to all of you. I'm Gary Myers, and it's my great honor to introduce our first speaker at this symposium. And before I do that, I too have a number of people to thank. First of all, thank you, Dave, and thank you, Ken, for all of your support and for getting along so well as deans. I also want to thank Price Sloan for your support. You made this happen. This is a wonderful symposium. The overall topic is one that's timely, and the topic that we have today is most certainly timely. So I'm very pleased to have this program begin. I also want to thank our other sponsors. First of all, the Kinder Forum on Constitutional Democracy, in conjunction with the National Endowment for Humanities, and the Missouri Humanities Council. I want to thank them for their generous support. Secondly, Mizzou Advantage. I want to thank Mizzou Advantage for helping with their Media for the Future program and their support of this symposium. And lastly, the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University has also provided sponsorship support. So I want to thank all of our sponsors, and let's give a round of applause to all of them, and Price in particular. Now I'm going to very shortly get out of the way and let Mayor Sly James give his remarks, but I want to tell you just a little bit about this tremendous man. He was born and raised in Kansas City and served a stint during the Vietnam War in the Marine Corps, where he was a military policeman. He then graduated from Rockhurst with his undergraduate degree and the University of Minnesota Law School. So he comes to this symposium in part from the law school side of this effort, this collaborative effort of law and media and journalism. And from there, he practiced law in Kansas City with a firm then known as Blackwell Sanders, where he became the first African-American partner in that firm. He subsequently formed his own firm in Kansas City before taking a successful run at becoming mayor. And he served since 2011 as mayor of Kansas City. And one fun fact that I'll tell you before I let him have the floor. During the days of Jefferson Airplane, which I remember well, and some of you, at least a few of you in the audience might remember, he was the lead singer for the opening act when Jefferson Airplane played in Kansas City. So that's a pretty neat fact that I have to share with you. But with no further ado, please welcome Mayor Sly James.
Well, I will also give my thanks to Price Sloan, who I had the pleasure of actually practicing law with at Blackwell Sanders quite some time ago. He's risen to some heights that I have not yet risen to, and I appreciate him being so generous as to start this symposium. And it's a good endeavor because right now I think that discussions about First Amendment cultural awareness and things of that nature are things that we certainly could use quite a lot of here in this country. So I want to say good afternoon to all of you and thank you for the invitation to be here with you on this, the first speaker on the first symposium. I don't know how much more august it could be than that. I even got a haircut for you, Price. It's my pleasure to be here to discuss my perspective on how free speech and cultural awareness converge, and in some cases, a lot of cases actually, diverge. My drive down here on I-70 this morning, I think, is the perfect backdrop for my remarks. I left my house in Union Hill. Union Hill is in the heart of Kansas City, and it's a neighborhood that overlooks the downtown skyline. If you're familiar with Kansas City, Union Hill is nestled between Crown Center and Hyde Park, and it sits on a hill, thus the name Union Hill. And from my deck, I can see downtown Kansas City, and it's really very pretty at night when I can go stand out there. Sometimes I go out there and I put a fan on the deck and I get a shirt and I loosen it up and I stand there like this, like on that movie, and look at what I call my kingdom when nobody can hear me. But I can see some of our jewels of Union Station, Kaufman Center for Performing Arts, and our brand new streetcar starter line downtown. And then as we hit the interstate this morning, I could see more details of the city that weren't quite as shiny as the ones that I've just described to you. A homeless man sleeping at a bus stop, a water main that was broken, and a police car screaming past us with the sirens and the lights on. But you know what? That's life in a big city. It's a lot of good, and there's some bad. As we drove further east a bit, I saw neighborhoods that were not as populated as we'd like to have them be, where there were many vacant and abandoned homes from the recession and from the real estate bubble that burst, where there's too much crime and not enough educational opportunity for the kids that live in those homes. But I can remember growing up in those neighborhoods, and a bunch of us, we'd ride our bikes around and we'd go to the parks and we'd hang out together, and we knew that when the sun started to go down and things started to get dark, the rule was when the porch lights came on, you better be home or in front of your home, or there would be hell to pay. We often got into some trouble, not serious trouble. None of it involved AR-15s, but we certainly were boys doing what boys did at that time. And, you know, we didn't want to be in a situation where our parents had to be coming after us to straighten us out, because back then, the corporal punishment was not only allowed in my neighborhood, it was encouraged. We continued on down I-70 as we came here, and then we look out and see the bluffs and the farmland and more rural areas as we entered Saline and Howard County. And, you know, as we make strides to bring families back to our urban core, and there is kind of a reverse diaspora where people are moving back from rural areas back to the cities. And we're making those strides, but decades of white flight from cities is not something that's reversed in a few years, and we'll continue to struggle with that. But we are rebuilding cities in a way that is attractive to them, and in fact, The huge amount, the majority of the population in the United States is concentrated in cities now. Our population is growing. Businesses are moving to our core. And the residents of our more rural counties, we often see them driving, doing their things that they do, showing up for job appointments. And as we pass through our suburban areas, we see a lot more of them who are driving back towards the city for jobs and other things, but prefer to live in a different environment. All of these places that we passed en route are different communities, and they have their unique needs, they have unique attributes, and they have unique challenges and contrasts. And there is no place that embodies all of those unique and different attributes, contrasts, challenges, and opinions between rural and urban Missouri than about 30 miles from here down the road at the state capitol in Jefferson City. There you'll find a dizzying array of ideologies and backgrounds, and you'll also find that there are a lot of reasons that are articulated there for not doing some important things like properly investing in the education of our children and infrastructure, and a bunch of reasons to do things that I find a little less compelling, like allowing 19-year-olds to acquire weapons with no permits and training. So the question that we have sometimes is it possible that free speech can add to this dysfunction in some way? And from my perspective as a mayor, the answer is maybe. These days, if we're Republican or if we're Democrat, we're likely to consume news and information from sources that simply reinforce our already strong beliefs and our political leanings. And then there's social media, where an opinion can be added to the public discourse almost instantaneously in 40 characters or less. And free speech there can often create some pretty explosive situations if we're not sure about the ramifications of what we're saying, and if the context is not properly stated or known. And to the point of these remarks today, these factors often further divide us, and if we're not culturally aware of each other, whether we're suburban, urban, or rural, then we can filter those for me, because when I grew up, education was the one commodity, the one thing that our parents insisted that we consume to the fullest extent possible. They sacrificed a great deal to send us to schools that they thought would provide us with the best education possible. In fact, we moved when I was 9 years old, we moved from Wyandotte County, Kansas to Kansas City, Missouri, specifically so they could place us in Catholic schools where they thought the best education options were. And back then, it wasn't a matter of simply moving into a parish and paying tuition. You had to convert to Catholicism. So if you know anything about being Southern Baptist in black families, you would know that that was a hell of a conversion. The good news was the services were a lot shorter, and they didn't have much to do for kids on Wednesday and Thursday nights. I will tell you, though, that I missed the singing and the Sunday after services dinners that we used to have at the church when I was growing up, because I developed a great taste for Mrs. Johnson's fried chicken. But it's an emotional topic for me, because if I had not had the opportunity to have the education that I have been able to acquire, I don't know where I would be today. I probably wouldn't be standing here as the mayor of Kansas City. There's a lot of discussions that go on in Jefferson City and in all sorts of other state houses around the country about education. How do we fully fund the foundation formula for education? And we're not fully funding it, by the way. Are charter schools good or bad? Why are we not investing more in quality pre-K education, where children's brains are still in the process of forming, and instead of waiting until they get to kindergarten to act like they actually exist as consumers. And especially when we know that quality pre-K, particularly in areas of poverty, have such a real potential to be life-changing in terms of a child's educational lifespan. Do black students learn better from black teachers? Is it necessary to have segregated schools or not? All of those things are always debated. One of the discussions that blows my mind the most, I hear from some legislators when I'm around them, is that rural legislators will tell me sometimes that they believe that Kansas City and St. Louis are consuming all of the money from their kids. Those kids in Kansas City and St. Louis are taking all the resources. Well, conversely, in the city, in the metro areas, we hear almost the opposite, that there's not enough money from Jefferson City in order to properly educate kids. And I know that neither of those statements is true to the extent that people would like us to believe. And I also know that throwing money at education has not necessarily solved anything. When I took office in 2011, one of the first things we looked at was third grade reading proficiency across our city's 15 school districts that exist in whole or in part within the boundaries of Kansas City. And I learned that third grade reading proficiency was one of the primary markers about potential educational success or downfalls. You learn to read up to third grade, and from third grade on, you're reading to learn. So if you haven't learned to read, you're not going to be learning much from that point on. And we also learned that poor communities where children are being raised, the kids there hear 30 million words fewer by the time they're 3 years old than their more affluent counterparts. So if you start off and you're 3 years old and you've heard 30 million fewer words, and then you have nothing to supplement that before you hit kindergarten, the next problem is that you're generally not kindergarten ready. And if you're not kindergarten ready, then you're going to have a hard time hitting the markers that you need to be proficient in third grade. And if you're not reading properly at third grade, then you're going to have a harder time graduating from high school. And if you have a harder time graduating from high school, you're going to make less money. If you make less money, you're going to have less health care options and have worse health care. Some neighborhoods in Kansas City, some zip codes, you can point them out in areas of poverty where the lifespan, the life expectancy is 5, 6, 10 years less than more affluent zip codes 6 blocks away. And it's all because of educational opportunities, which leads to job and employment opportunities, et cetera. So what we did was, without looking at the money aspect, we set about using tutors and reading buddies. And we've been able to raise that 33% average that we found to 49% so far. But we knew that pointing fingers at each other wasn't going to solve the problem. And we knew that legislation wasn't going to solve the problem. If we wanted to get it done, we needed to get it done ourselves. And we had the ability in our city to put those programs together in order to get that done. So what I wonder when I talk to our legislators is, why can't we simply view our young people as potential entrepreneurs, potential public servants, potential doctors, and provide them with the tools that they need in order to achieve those goals? And maybe even, God forbid, look at our young people as the future of this state, because that's exactly what they are. I mentioned that we also share some values, and I think we can all agree that it would be in our shared interest that every child in this state receive not just an accredited education, which seems to be the goal of some districts from time to time, but a world-class education. Because I'm sure that people like Price Sloan can tell you, we're not competing with the school district 2 blocks over. We're competing with the country on the other side of the ocean, and the kids that are there and the businesses that are there. This is world-class competition. We need world-class education. So it's hard to concentrate on our shared values, however, when we are being fed by Fox News or CNN News or Facebook friends or Twitter followers or the latest celebrity on Tumblr, all telling us that whoever we're not is our enemy. And how we then engage in that divisive activity and thought process, where we actually start to believe that whoever is not us is our enemy on certain things. And that seems to be something that's occurring at an accelerated rate. So free speech is our First Amendment right. It's fundamental to a democratic society. But at the same time, don't we have some sort of moral obligation to approach public policy with some compassion and some common sense? Not a bad foundation for a democratic society. But you can basically throw that out the window when we get to discussions about guns. Now, there's a true disconnect that I deal with all the time between what I'm constantly being told is the rural perspective versus the urban perspective. So let me, first of all, acknowledge my biases, okay? I'm not rural. I am a city kid. However, I was forced, against my will, I might add, to travel to the sugarcane fields of Louisiana every summer as a kid to spend time with my grandmother. I think my parents delighted in sending us there, where she lived essentially in a one-room shack with no running water. There was a board across a ditch from the street to her house that we walked across, and chickens running around, and we chased chickens. That was our sport, chasing chickens. That was either a sport or bringing in water from the well to put in a big tub so that we could bathe in it, which was always fun. It's nothing like having grandma watch you bathe when you're a kid. Or we could go to other relatives in the area who had more of a farm environment and watch them gut a hog. That made me want to stay a lot longer. Just wasn't my thing. But I did learn a lot about the folks who lived in that environment. And basically what I learned is that at the end of the day, they were pretty stand-up people. They had a very clear idea of right and wrong, and they had a very clear idea of their place in society, and they had a very clear idea of what they wanted for their children, just like people in the urban environment. Another bias that I have is that I'm not a hunter. I don't shoot skeet. My experience with guns was pretty extensive when I was in the Marine Corps. I fired 50 cal, 30 cal, M1s, M16s, which is really the prototype for the AR-15. I threw hand grenades. I shot bazookas, light anti-tank weapons, and 9 millimeters and 45 caliber pistols. The only thing that we really never got to was flamethrowers, and that was probably wise. Somebody would have been a crispy critter if they had let us have flamethrowers to practice with. But guns don't scare me. I'm not anti-gun, and I'm not anti-Second Amendment. I will also tell you another bias that I have, and that is that my life has been severely impacted by the fact that as the mayor of a city that has a high homicide rate, 80% of the homicide victims being black, 80% of the homicide perpetrators being black, and 90% of the homicides being committed with handguns or rifles. I have a bias about that, particularly as a direct result of going to homicide scenes on a Sunday morning when I get a call and a 2-year-old has been shot while sleeping in their bed by somebody firing on a drive-by firing rifle through a house. And the weapon is so powerful that it not only passes through the first house, but enters a second house as well. Or a homicide where some idiot with a gun kills an estranged girlfriend and then kills the 3-year-old daughter because she witnessed it. Or all of those things that we see. The last one that was, not the last one, but one of the ones that really did bother me was a 17-year-old high school student who had a 1-year-old child at a house where she lived or stayed with a 16-year-old friend, not a boyfriend, just a friend who was there with her, and the estranged boyfriend coming and blowing them all away, including the infant. Those are the things that kind of inform my thoughts about some of the issues that I deal with. And I don't have a problem with anybody who is actually trained to have a weapon and knows how to use a weapon and wants to use it for hunting or skeeting or self-protection. My issue has been, always will be, and will remain until the day that I die, that unless we are willing to say that anybody, everybody should have a weapon, then we have to decide who shouldn't and under what circumstances and how do we avoid letting them have it. So violent crime, along with some challenging educational issues, are the Achilles heel in the city that is known across the country and really in certain parts of the world as being on the cutting edge of technology, a place for millennials to settle, where entrepreneurs come to thrive, where Tech Week adopted us after the first year as the second best Tech Week city in the country, where we've been written up as best places to live, most friendly, all sorts of different things. But then we always get back to the issues of education and violent crime. You know, guns in Kansas City are sometimes more prevalent than books in homes. And guns and whether everyone or anyone should have them has always been the issue. And there is a cultural divide on that topic that really does need to be closed. Now, another thing I should tell you, in case you haven't guessed, is I am not endorsed by the NRA. We have some tunnel vision about some of the issues in the states, and guns is one of them. A couple of days ago, I did a press conference where we discussed and argued about overriding Senate Bill 656. I was there along with Deputy Chief of Police, the county sheriff, the woman who heads as the CEO, one of the abuse shelters, the prosecutor, a person who does training for people who acquire permits, and several others to talk about the impact of a bill that basically removes just about any current existing restrictions on the ability to acquire a weapon. You no longer need to have a permit, and you don't have to go through any training in order to acquire a gun. And it applies to anybody who's 19 years old. In that same bill is an extension of the Castle Doctrine and an extension of the Stand Your Ground Doctrine, so that now you no longer have to be in a house that you own. You can be in any place where you lawfully are or can be, and you only need to feel threatened in order to use deadly force. Doesn't have to be in a demonstration of a real threat. You just have to feel threatened. So I liken this to getting a diagnosis of cancer and on that same day deciding to become a chain smoker. It ain't helping. It's not going to make you any better. It's certainly not going to make you any safer. So I've been advocating for a regulatory scheme that addresses the issues particular to cities. I don't care what people do in rural counties with weapons. That's not my concern. What I'm concerned about is what people do with weapons in cities, because there's not much hunting in Kansas City unless you're doing urban hunting. And what we see in cities like Kansas City and Chicago and others is slow motion mass murder. And by that I mean when everybody gets very tied up in the mass murder of the day or the month, which occur with increasing rapidity, and there's a huge hue and cry, all those kids killed in the school and all the people killed out in California, and then it just fades into the backdrop until the next one comes up. Well, in my city, we're at 82 murders this year already. And that's more than any of those other incidental, episodic mass murders. But it's just in slow motion, where we get to watch people die day after day after day and deal with the aftermath of that. That's what I want to address. So what happens in Drain County is not the same thing as what happens at 42nd and Montgall. I grew up at 44th and Montgall, and it was in the ghetto at the time, but never once felt the need to have a weapon and never acquired one. But I do understand why some people might want to have one. Now, the discourse on this issue belies a lot of common sense. And one of the things that bothers me is that it's used as a wedge between citizens. You're either pro or anti Second Amendment. Not really. There's a big difference between all and nothing. There's a big gap there that you can do some things in, but we won't do it. And the reason that that approach is being taken is that while we're fighting each other about whether we're pro or anti, there's a lot of people profiting from that argument while we're fighting each other. Okay? There's a huge amount of money that is both made and that is paid to politicians to take the positions that they take. Politicians, when you talk to them, are absolutely afraid of having somebody run against them in a primary, so they will take an extreme position. And I'm not making this up. I'm telling you because I spend time talking to them and trying to convince them to do something otherwise. And it's not just Republicans. There are Democrats that I've talked to who, when I say, why are you supporting this bill? Well, it's going to pass anyhow. And since it's going to pass, if I stand against it, I'll be labeled as anti-gun. And if I'm labeled as anti-gun, somebody will fund my opponent. So basically then what I'm hearing is I would much rather be reelected than to take a stand on something that I believe to be wrong. Now, if we can't muster common sense and compassion to consider that the sound bites on these issues are bought and paid for by people that we don't see, and we won't take into account that if we actually tried to do something, we might actually save a few lives, then we're in trouble. But only real leadership can do that, and there simply isn't enough leadership to go around. And I think if you're paying attention to the national conversation about politics, I don't think that there's many people who would disagree with that statement that leadership is in short supply anymore. So I made some waves on Tuesday. I made some people mad when I said that the legislature was doubling down on stupid when if they were to override the governor's veto. But you know what? I wasn't saying they were stupid, but the bill is. It doesn't take into account, it doesn't account for the fact that basically we're saying that there really are no rules related to weapons in this state, and just about anybody can have one. And so when I'm standing there talking to, I'm on the board of police commissioners in the city, and when I'm standing there talking to police officers and they're telling me how much tenser it is for them to walk up to a vehicle now where you can legally, at the age of 19, legally have a weapon in your vehicle and they don't know it, and if they see it, they can't do anything about it. Yeah, it's going to make you a little bit leery of stopping vehicles sometimes. It's going to make you a little jumpy sometimes if there's a furtive move. We are creating environments for conflict, and the conflicts often involve weapons. And then when those conflicts occur, then it tears at the very fabric of the society. It becomes black and white. It becomes law and order versus criminal. It becomes all sorts of things. Some of that's going to happen naturally, but we sure as heck shouldn't be promoting it. So I think I probably enraged some of the legislators. Again, you know, life's tough. When I suggested that I would send them an invitation to come do ride-alongs with me in Kansas City on some Friday or Saturday night, and let's see how much safer they felt in those environments than where they are. We should know that the tension between rural and urban on issues like this is being purposely promoted. There's an organization called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, that for 43 years has been a collaboration between conservative politicians and big business interests. And they pass around from state to state relative cookie cutter legislation to accomplish certain goals, and this bill is one of them. There's 10 states now where you have the alleged constitutional carry, which means if you want a gun, you get a gun, you carry a gun. That's constitutional carry. 10 states now have that. Those bills were perpetrated by ALEC. Issues against minimum wage and changing the income disparity, perpetrated by ALEC. All sorts of things. That's what they do. They invite legislators to come to their meetings at very nice places where they pick up all the expenses and everything else and pass around legislation that people do. Very interesting thing, I was told, at least, that it got to be so blatant at one point that legislation that was being attempted to be passed in Missouri was rejected because they forgot to scratch out the name of Illinois, where the legislation had passed just a few months earlier. If we are going to truly have free speech, if we are going to truly examine cultural divides, then let me suggest to you that this is the perfect place for that. On college campuses, in law schools, particularly with lawyers. One thing I do know about lawyers and the training that lawyers receive, since I've been there and done that, is that we are taught to look at the various aspects of an issue, to examine the strengths and the weaknesses, to look at how it applies to the law, to somehow measure the impact on society, to try to decide in some instances what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad, and what the law can do about it or what the law can't do about it, and then to apply those things. Lawyers solve problems. I thought legislators were supposed to solve problems, but in my experience, they do more to create problems than they do to solve. But lawyers solve problems. Lawyers engage in debate on one side of a case or another. Lawyers are willing to adjudicate. Lawyers can have an argument about a hot topic and then go have a beer. At least good lawyers can. So if we're going to have a renaissance of free speech, if we're going to have a true discussion of our cultural differences in a way that furthers the goals of society, that furthers what we're trying to do in order to become the truly great nation that we should be, greater nation that we should be. We've always been great, but we can be greater. If we're going to have an opportunity to mend all these personal, emotional, psychological rifts that have been created, then lawyers are going to be the ones at the center of that. I believe that the Constitution is sacred. I do not believe that it was written in blood and it's never changed. If that were the case, we would not need a Supreme Court. But I do believe that as we start to look at issues in the context of constitutions, both state and federal, we have to be aware of the changes that are wrought in society. I was talking to Gary Meyer about intellectual property. And I would dare say when I was in law school, intellectual property didn't mean then what it means now. And I would say that intellectual property today isn't going to be what intellectual property is 25 years from now. It has to expand in order to encompass new and different circumstances. So does our speech. So does our contact with people. So does our interaction on college campuses. So does our understanding of each other. So I feel obligated. I feel that as a mayor, which I happen to believe is the best job in politics, and I'll tell you why. As a mayor, we do stuff. We have to make sure every single day that our cities operate. And it's not just that we do it from some closed door. When I walk out of my office onto the street, I see my constituents every day. They will stop you dead in your tracks and say, Mayor, why is blank? What are you doing about X? When I go to the grocery store, aside from the occasional question of, Mayor, you buy your own food? Yeah, I do my own eating too. They always want to talk, and they hold you accountable. That doesn't happen on any other levels of government. Think about it. The legislators that come down to Jefferson City and do their thing, and it's really funny. If you want to see something funny, go to a ribbon cutting, and there's local people in office, local electeds, and legislative people. And watch what happens if one of the legislative people is not properly recognized. Oh, they get their hair up in a bunch, but they're not there. People don't know who they are. I'd be willing to bet you if I asked half of this room, or this entire room, to tell me who your state rep and your state senator was, you have no idea. But I can probably bet that you probably have some idea of who your mayor is in whatever city you are. Because that's local. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's why I think it's the best job, because we are held accountable and we have to produce. So it's my job to do everything I can to make sure that the children in my city, even though I have no control over any of the 15 school districts, I still have an obligation, both moral, practical, and political, to make sure that every kid in my city, regardless of race, regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of what zip code they're in, can have access to a world-class education. It's in the best interest of them, it's in the best interest of us, it's in the best interest of the city. It's also my job to do everything I can to try to keep people safe. So as long as I have the job, which will be 3 more years, I will be somebody that you probably read about saying, there he goes again, yelling and screaming about this stuff, but I'm going to yell and scream about it until somebody actually hears it. So, with the combined gift granted to us under the Constitution of free speech, and with the access that you have to the quality education that you have here, there is an opportunity for us to have an impact on the national discourse and to use our gifts and our constitutional rights for good, not just for politics, not just to satisfy narrow political meanings, whether they're Republican or Democratic, but to actually use our gifts and opportunities for good. So, I will say this. As a Marine, I was taught to improvise, adapt, and overcome. And the older I get, the more I realize that overcoming doesn't mean that I'm going to get some immediate gratification. But it does mean that I have an obligation to complete the mission and to try to do the best I can for my city. And I want to thank you for allowing me to come here and open up your symposium. It's been a great honor. And I also want to tell you that I have nothing but respect for lawyers. I can tell you when you go out to practice, if you're not out there now, that you will be in much demand. There's not a board or a commission that doesn't have a lawyer on it, and if it does, they're looking for one. And lawyers integrate themselves throughout the nooks and crannies of society. And that's where you can have an impact if you recognize that we have these cultural divides and you use your free speech and your education to try to close them. Thank you very much. Questions? I will try to answer questions if anyone has any. Yes, sir?
You used guns to highlight the difference between urban and rural Missouri and how there's just a divide. And to me, it sounds like it's a misunderstanding between the two camps.
I agree.
There's a breakdown of communication or something. How do you propose we try to bridge that gap? Is there a lack of a central, I guess, reasonable narrative? Is there just lack of empathy? What do you propose we do?
The narrative is being pushed by those who would have us believe that the only way to be safe in our homes and in our lives is to be armed because of the other people out there, mostly urban, who are coming to kill us. One thing that I think would help is if we could simply have a conversation without going to the extremes. You know, I hear people, some urban people say, you know, that living in the cities is like living in the Wild West. It's not. In the Wild West, when you rode into town, you had to leave your guns at the sheriff's office. Only the sheriff and the deputies had guns. There's a lot of myths out there, but there's a lot of people who profit from the division. Just one fun stat. There's 1.1 guns for every man, woman, and child in the United States. 1.1. Now, that's a lot of money. And there is profit to be made there, and the divisions are being seeded by those who stand to benefit. I think one thing that we should do, if you want to know the truth of the matter, we need to end gerrymandering. Because in the gerrymandering process, the elections are set up so that the only thing you really have to fear is a primary opponent. And in order to eliminate that, people move to the extremes in order to occupy that space. So we're moving out of the middle and the moderate into the extremes. If we can go back to a more reasonable legislative governance approach, some of this would end. I blame, to some extent, term limits. Term limits don't help. There's always been term limits. It's called an election. You don't like who's in office, vote them out. Vote somebody else in. But when you find somebody who's actually doing the job, and then at the end of it, the end of 2 terms, you say, well, you got to go. What happens is those folks start doing those things that are necessary to make decisions that will allow them to be elected to a higher position or a different position or to get a job. So they start compromising on right and wrong and start becoming politically pragmatic. Let's bring it back down to where it was. Make the election process fairer, get rid of the gerrymandering. And in doing so, and I would say get rid of the term limits, and the reason I say that is because when you didn't have term limits, what we had were people who were there for extended periods of time. They become a subject matter expert on something. Now you don't see subject matter experts. You don't have time. They're there for 2 terms. But the subject matter experts would be the go-to people on a subject, whether they're rural or urban. And because of that center that they had, they were friends with a lot of different people, and you actually talk together. Now, if you're a Democrat, you're over here. If you're a Republican, you're over there. If you're a Libertarian, you're over there. And never the twain shall meet. Those divisions are the same ones that show up in our relationships between rural, urban, and suburban. And the politicians that come from them have a stake in keeping those divisions there, because then they create their own base from which they can be elected because of gerrymandering. So, long question. But I do also think that, once again, you're in a very unique situation. One of the things I love most about being in the Marine Corps was that I ran into people I never even knew existed from places that I'd never been. But because we had one very common purpose, i.e. staying alive, we got along pretty well. And we talked about our lives and what was going on. And I learned that whatever I may have thought about somebody who came from a farm in Georgia was really pretty wrong. And they learned that whatever they ever thought about a black guy from the city of Kansas City, Missouri was probably not correct. And we got past that. And I think we need to do a lot of that across this entire country if we're going to change things around. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
So part of your solution is to have interpersonal conversations, which I think are very important. But what role is there for journalism in helping to heal some of these divides as well?
You mean journalism or media?
Journalism.
Journalism. You mean people who actually know how to express real thoughts and put things out there that make sense based on facts and maybe tell a story that gets people engaged and people can kind of rely on, or the ones where you have to have really good hair and good looks and ask a lot of opinions? You're talking about journalism. The role for journalism, in my opinion, is very strong. Journalists need to go back to doing their jobs. When's the last, seriously, I think that we've suffered in that regard since Watergate, to be honest. You know, newspapers are dying. They're just dying. And that will be a huge problem in this country, because newspapers used to be where you could actually find out what was really going on behind the scenes. Now in Kansas City, with the Kansas City Star, they're laying people off. They've laid people off. And they don't have nearly the ability to get behind the scenes and tell the truth and be investigative and be at the courthouse and be at the city hall and be down in Jefferson City and report on what's really going on. So what do we get? We get Twitter, we get Facebook, we get people who blog, And there's absolutely no requirement whatsoever that they be accurate, fair, or balanced. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't want to use those two words in conjunction. So journalism can do what journalism I've always thought could do, which is keep the people of this country informed about the reality, not the opinion, and to find out what's really going on and report on those issues in such a way that anybody who has the ability to pick up a newspaper or an iPad can see what's actually going on and digest it without all the patina of right wing, left wing, strange wing, or little wing, as Jimi Hendrix would call it. Yes, ma'am. Well, the journalists are the ones that I would expect to be free speeching a lot and saying what needs to be said and putting it out there in a factual way so that people can digest it. And the lawyer's role is to defend their right to do that. I think it's the traditional role of journalism. I don't think that role has changed. I just think that the reality has changed. Journalism seems to have, in my opinion, been co-opted to some extent by the issue of immediacy. You know, right now, if you can't get it out there within 24 hours, then you're already behind the curve. By the time that a serious journalist can approach a subject and do something in depth on it, people have already made up their minds. They've read about it twice on Twitter. It must be true. So the role of journalism and lawyers is somewhat symbiotic. Journalists have the obligation to inform the American people about the good and the bad and the ugly, and lawyers have the obligation to make sure that they have the ability unfettered to do that. Any more? Yes, sir.
Your experience in Kansas City, the relationship between the journalists that you know and the people that you know, who are part of the stories that local journalists cover, what is the relationship like in terms of the trust that each has with the other? And if you've seen that trust weaken, and if so, what has eventually led to that?
To some extent, it depends on the journalist. I deal with a number of different journalists from the written publications, the newspapers. Some of them are opinion writers, editorial writers. Some of them are straight up reporters. I like the reporters. There's a different way, and I don't have a major problem with some of the opinion people, except it's different. But the reporters will ask you about what happened, what's the facts here, what is your thought on it, why did you do this, etc. Where can I find this piece of paper, who else do I need to talk to, and they'll go out and scrounge and do that. The editorial writers will simply appear somewhere, and then the next thing you know, they're writing an opinion piece without having really dived into it based on what they saw or heard. But the relationship is great. Where I have the biggest problem is with bloggers, because I met with a blogger this is just one example. I met with a blogger when I was running, and I said, I've read your stuff. Half of the stuff you print isn't even close to being true. And he said, yeah, I know, but it's my job to stir stuff up. He didn't use the word stuff, but that's what he meant. And he does that because it gets a rise out of people and it becomes very talked about, which drives his issue, his interests of being popular and being out there. So I, by far, prefer to deal with a reporter. I don't mind the editorial staff. We appear before the editorial staff periodically and spend an hour with them going in depth about a particular subject. If we're going to do a GO bond, we're going to talk about it in depth. If we want to extend streetcar, we're going to sit down with them. When they're asking why are the homicide numbers going up this year instead of down, we will sit with them and give them facts, and then we get pretty even-handed treatment. But that doesn't happen with bloggers. I will guarantee you, and I saw yesterday some of the blog pieces and Twitter spots and Facebook spots where things were just being totally misrepresented, but in the minds of people who responded to it, it was the truth. Journalists have an obligation to correct the record and to present a true record as much as possible, in my opinion. Yes, sir?
How do you back away from comments or statements that can be perceived as being sort of incendiary or inflammatory? And I'm just sort of, and not no disrespect, but when you sort of say, I care about Kansas City, but not Aldrin County.
No. What I said is, I don't care about what they do with guns.
Right. Well, but so in that same vein, the notion of doubling down on security, right? That you're speaking objectively, you're speaking passionately, you're speaking about what you believe, and yet others will say that, will look at that and go, wait a minute, that's inflammatory, right? Or the other side will look at something and say something and say, well, how that's being inflammatory? And because it's a 24-hour news cycle, it's a soundbite, all right? You've got stakeholders, you've got people who need to hear your message. And so how do we get past that kind of noise to get to the kernel of what actually free speech should be protected, right? That I can express this, I can disagree with you, and now let's work together to move beyond it, when all we hear is the phrase or the soundbite or that which is going to ignite the kind of sort of the vitriol.
And what you didn't hear were the weeks and the number of conversations where none of that was said. Where the only way sometimes to get the attention of the mule is to hit them over the head with the stick. And the only way that you sometimes get the attention of a legislator is to make them mad. Because half the time when you want to talk to them about stuff, they won't even talk to you. The ones who do, I met with a state senator, when we were both at a conference in Las Vegas. We sat down, we had a very great conversation about this very topic a few weeks ago. And in the process of that conversation, he basically said, yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, I agree that it doesn't make any sense, but it's an election year. And this is something that's going to pass. This is something that is going to, the veto is going to be overridden. And frankly, there's just no sense in me coming out and going against it because it does me no good. I'm sorry. I'm looking for people who are leaders who will do the right thing, and that's not it. So, yeah, there are times when I go off the rails a little bit and say things that I back up on. But at the end of the day, I generally don't do it until after I've exhausted all the niceties. And I spend a lot of time down there with those guys, and most of them are guys. I mean, I'm down in the State House now, and you know, the chief of staff or one of the leaders leaves a loaded Glock in the bathroom. They go to the Missouri Supreme Court, and the guards there take 48 weapons off of legislators going into the Missouri Supreme Court. So after a while, you kind of get a little fired up when they refuse to acknowledge that there are problems in my area, and they simply tell me, you know what, we don't really care. So yeah, you're right, and it is inflammatory, and maybe I shouldn't say it, but on the other hand, I try to be nice before I get to the nasty. Yes, sir.
Do you think none of these issues are really going to get addressed until money stops control?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Money is the root of all political evil. There's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. There's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. And until we can get a handle on that, now you got to remember that until this last term, there were really no ethical limits in the state of Missouri. I don't think there's any limitations on the amount that you can receive in contributions, which explains why a single individual in St. Louis can give an unknown lieutenant gubernatorial candidate $750,000. And the sad thing about it is that he keeps giving money to people and they keep losing. He at least ought to find a winner in there somewhere. But, you know, the flow of money from special interests, a single person company owner in Joplin who gives $500,000 to selected House representatives so that they can make sure the right to work passes the next time. That kind of takes the debate out of the issue as to whether or not this is a good idea or a bad idea. Because once you get the money, I don't care who you are, once you get the money, the guy calls up and says, you're going to vote for this. Good luck on saying no. Because if you do say no, guarantee you, and he did this time, he ran primaries against people who voted against his wishes, and a couple of them lost. So money is the root of evil in politics, in my opinion. And what was the Supreme Court case? Citizens United. Bad idea. Bad idea. That needs to be changed, or we're never going to get beyond this. And we'll just continue to get more and more polarized. Besides, who's got more money? The people in this room or the gun manufacturers? The people in this room or the oil companies? The people in this room and Wall Street? So whose interests do you think are being protected? When the lobbyists are writing laws, they're not writing them to protect us. They're writing them to benefit them. Way too much monetary influence in politics, and it's having a negative impact on our country and our society. Yes, sir. One more? Any more? Yes, sir.
So, first, a kudo and one question. I did have the privilege of hearing you speak when our prior mayor, had a task force on violence. I do appreciate, because this is an area that's both urban, rural, and suburban, if you look at our school district.
Right.
And I was very gratified, although I forget the term, but this is the kudo, that our city officials have decided to adopt your program, basically for dealing with those who have violence both before and after incarceration.
Casey Nova.
Yeah, so I'm very proud that that is now going to be part of our community, so I appreciate you coming, and you have had an impact. Then I want to ask in general, just kind of hypothesizing, given that we have, very polarized narratives, very shallow journalism, when you mentioned especially the cable news channels, that even some of the folks on those channels who wanted to have greater discussion for lack of ratings were either told to change or no longer on the air, such as Melissa Harris-Perry. Right. Who was very articulate and very brilliant. So just, if I was a young journalism student dealing with the Goliath of the reality of mass media, which is basically run by the very same people who are making those contributions, any suggestions you would have?
Wow. I don't know much about the journalism business, but I still think that newspapers are important. They're not hiring, but certainly visual media is the sexy thing. But they do have to hire, because it's running 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, forever. And there's always an opportunity to repeat the same story that somebody heard 23 hours ago. I don't know that I have the ability or the background to make recommendations on journalism students. I think, one of the things that I like to think about lawyers is that when we decided to go to law school, a lot of us decided because that's where we thought we could actually have an impact and do something of value. And I kind of think that a lot of journalists are the same way. Then student loans get in the way, and you got to make a living and all of that other stuff. But I really think that sometimes we have to just push the purity of what it is, the social responsibility. And frankly, there are very few other careers or life paths that have more social responsibility than journalism in the pure sense of the word and law. There are huge responsibilities to the general public in those areas. I just think that people have to find a way to live their lives and career in a way that meets up with their goals and aspirations for why they went to J school or law school in the first place. And I'm not smart enough to be able to give them any advice on that except good luck, and I hope you find what you're looking for. Did you have something?
Proposals that you put forth in terms of gun control in your time as mayor?
We wanted to, excuse me, we wanted to have a law in the city of Kansas City, Missouri, that if your gun was stolen or lost, you needed to report it to the police. And that was a no, couldn't do that. We wanted to enhance some penalties for people who use guns in a crime, and that was a no because we're preempted. The state will not let us do those things. We wanted to, and the thing that I'm trying to do now is I'm trying to get our courts to establish an armed offender docket so that when somebody does commit a crime with a gun, that they're in a specific docket with specific judges who see these types of things on a repeated basis so that we can collect data, so that we can have some uniformity of results. And right now, fighting with the courts on this has been a real eye-opening experience. This gentleman mentioned KC NOVA, Kansas City No Violence Alliance. It's a unique focused deterrence approach to crime, and it consists of the board members of KC NOVA or myself, the prosecutor, the chief of police, the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Missouri, the head of the FBI office for the Western District, the head of ATF for the Western District, UMKC, Social Services and Probation and Parole. And the idea of KC NOVA is that we have a two-pronged approach. We have call-ins every quarter. Call-in is where we encourage or compel people who are involved in criminal activity or on the verges of being involved in criminal activity based on the research that our educational arm, UMKC, has done, where we've been able to identify those people who are at the center of violence and all of their connections and relationships. So if you put it up on this wall, which it wouldn't be big enough, you would be able to see an individual with a huge spider web coming out with the contacts and who they touch for a lot of different people. And then we start going to those contacts and trying to pick them off and say, we know who you are, we know who you're hanging out with, now here's your choice. You can take advantage of social services. We will basically set you up with a concierge type of an approach on social services. If you need your birth certificate, you need your driver's license, if you need training for jobs, if you need to go back and get a GED, we will help you do all of that as long as you work with us. If you do not, then we will come after you and all of your associates and put you in jail. Those are your options. And the other part of what we say to them is, once we leave this call-in, the next body that hits the ground, if you or any of your associates are involved in that, we will try to dismantle your relationships and your group. And we've done that. Now, so we've got everybody over here in government, social services, law enforcement, and we can't get the courts to pay a single bit of attention to us. They're the only ones not at the table. They won't engage for whatever reason. They don't want to do it. They don't want to be told what to do. In St. Louis, it was a well-publicized by journalists in St. Louis fight about the clash between the county attorneys and all of those folks versus the court, and it got nasty. And then more and more stories kept coming out, and they started pointing out this person who committed this murder had been in court, and the courts let him out on an SIS, and 6 months later he's killing somebody. And they would write that up. And then the courts in St. Louis are doing a armed offender docket. I'm having problems getting our courts in Kansas City to do the same. That's a proposal. That would have real impact because we're trying to treat both ends of this. We're trying to stop people who shouldn't get guns from getting them, and we're trying to take care of those who use guns for the wrong purposes and do something with them on the court side that has more impact. Right now, we have a lot of people that are involved in violent gun crimes and violent gun actions, and the courts will see them, they will give them an SIS, or they'll give them a low bond, and they're back out on the street intimidating witnesses. Trials take 2 years, yada, yada, yada. So we're trying to approach it that way. Those are the things. And we went to the legislature. We got one legislator down there who would help us with it. And he stuck by us. And we weren't able to get it passed because the courts came down and argued against it, and that was the end of that. So we're doing a lot of different things, but little things like if you lose your gun or it's stolen from you, you have to report it. Yeah, that's not a Second Amendment issue. That's a common sense issue. And why are we doing that? Because when Missouri, years ago, I think in 2000, they got rid of the permit to purchase law. Permit to purchase law basically said you can purchase a weapon, but you need to get a permit, and it takes 6 days between the time that you get the permit and the time that you can purchase to do it, in which time an extensive background check will be done, yada, yada, yada. And for some reason, poof, it went away. And then some interesting things started happening. The murder rate went up, and the FBI and the ATF will tell you that the time frame between a purchased gun winding up in a crime shortened considerably, which meant that there were more illegal weapons on the street than there used to be, and they were showing up quicker because it was easier to get them. That's why I'm straining against what's going on now, because the easier it is for guns to be there, the more guns there will be. And I don't think that it's a mystery between the fact that this country has more guns on the streets of its cities, counties, and rural areas than any place on the earth, and also happens to average about 33,000 gun-related deaths a year, a large percentage of which are rural suicide by guns, a large percentage of which are accidental shootings of kids, and a very large percentage of which are murders. So those are some of the things.
In there, did you, let me think about what
I can do a speech over if it helps. Do a rewind.
You said these proposals were put forth to make sure people who shouldn't be allowed to have arms to not buy them.
Right.
How do you determine who can and cannot have a firearm?
Well, that's a great discussion topic, isn't it? But if you can't have a discussion on that, then it's kind of hard to make that determination. But let me give you a few for instances. I happen to think that if you have been convicted of domestic violence, you probably shouldn't have a gun. I happen to think that if you've been convicted of a gun crime, you probably shouldn't have a gun. If you are a felon, you probably shouldn't have a gun. When the permit system, you got to remember now, this permit system isn't just for show. The Jackson County Sheriff had denied 900 permits. He had denied them to people who were on SIS from gun violence crimes. He had denied them to people who were involved in domestic violence. He had denied them to people who had been involved in assaults with deadly weapons. And now, since there is no permit, those 900 people, if they're out there, they can still get a gun. They can get it illegally, or I'm not denying that. But now they don't even need to worry about a permit. So I think we could have an intelligent discussion about who shouldn't. And unless somebody says everybody, without any restrictions whatsoever, whether you're a 1-year-old or a 90-year-old, whether you're blind in both eyes and walking on one leg and have no trigger finger, everybody gets a gun. If we can agree that's not going to work, then we have to automatically assume that not everybody should have a gun. And we could have a conversation about who those somebody shouldn't be. If you have a history of mental illness that has resulted in some sort of a conviction, or some sort of a lockup, or even a problem that indicates that you are prone to violence, should you have a gun? I don't know. It seems to be the clarion call now when we have these mass murders that, well, it's all because of mental illness. If we just did a better job with that or whatever. But try to get money out of the state legislature to address mental illness. So let me ask you, who do you think ought to have a gun?
Who I think ought to have a gun?
Yeah. Or not, whichever is
Who
easy.
shouldn't have a gun? A felon.
Okay? Well, that ain't gonna matter much at this point. Okay. Unless there's any other questions, I'm done. Thank you very much.